before I introduce our panel speakers today, we're all going to introduce ourselves in terms of the gender spectrum. And so I'm going to do that as well. And I'm also going to tell you some of the fundamental concepts that come up in this, because we know them and we don't know them at the same time. And they're linked, but they're not the same. Most of us have the luxury and the privilege of growing up thinking these things are simple and binary. But for many, they are not. And that's why we need to learn about that. Now, I am male by sex, male by gender, homosexual in orientation, and I'm drawn to some activities that are traditionally male and some that are traditionally female. And I'll unpack that so that you can understand why saying all of that is important. But first, let me say that about 10 years ago, I believe it was in seminary, I suddenly found myself saying something that I actually stopped in my tracks and wondered, where did this come from? I was referring to something that happened when I was young, and I said, when I was a little girl, and it was like, what? And I found myself doing that from time to time over a period of a few years, and I think I've just stopped. I think maybe I call myself a child now. But I didn't really know why I said that. I have told you before that I was a sissy, and I'm proud actually to have been a sissy, a grown-up sissy now. I'm still a sissy in some ways, and quite proud because it takes a bit of bravery to be a sissy. I preferred girls as playmates, dolls as toys. I dressed up as princesses occasionally when I was visiting their houses. I wished I could go to pajama parties, but that wasn't allowed. And my favorite sport was skipping, and I was darn good at it. Now, I never thought of myself as a girl, but I wished I could be one in the sense that I would then get to be with girls doing girl things all the time, and that was just so much more interesting than boys and boy things for me. But around 9 years old, I just stopped doing that. And in many ways, I feel like I have put it away. I have not ever been interested in doing drag as an adult. In fact, I don't really want to. And maybe that's because I did leave that behind. But it did just stop. And I started doing things some things that were more like boys and other things that were more like everybody else. So now let me go back and unpack that part that I was talking about, those 4 ways of identifying. Sex is about our bodies, our anatomy. And in general terms, we are born male with male genitalia or female with female genitalia. And so that is a fact generally known at birth by the people outside the person who has no self-consciousness as yet. Of course, occasionally people are born in an intersex situation where either their genitals are partly male and female, or on the outside they look one, and on the inside where the glands are there's something else, and that all only emerges later on. But sex is about our anatomy. Gender is about how we perceive ourselves in sexual terms, in terms of male or female, or neither male nor female, or some mixture of those. The illustration on your order of service today shows that whole gender spectrum from Barbie to G.I. Joe. And I bet there's some on the other end of both sides of those, we may be born with the genitals of a male, and yet at a very early age know that we are female. And finally, society is catching up to the fact that some children know this at a very early age. So that's gender. Sexual orientation is about the way you love and who you're attached to or who you are drawn to in terms of romance and sexual behavior. That's another independent variable. which can also has its own spectrum. It's not binary. And then finally, gender role is about how you want to be as you express your sex, gender, and sexual orientation. And so there are gay men who are incredibly traditionally male, hunters, sportsmen. There are lesbian women who are very female models, lipstick-wearing lesbians is what I've heard sometimes, lipstick lesbians. And then there are also people in other forms. Increasingly, men are less traditional than they used to be, especially Canadians and especially Unitarian men. I've come across a lot of men in Unitarian congregations that are not traditionally male, at least not all the time. And that's not a bad thing. It means you often feel fine about cooking dinner for your partner coming home from work. I better stop talking or I'll get into some kind of terrible corner of old-fashioned thinking. But anyway, hold on to those concepts. Anatomy is sex, psychology is gender, love is orientation, and behavior is gender role. Because we're going to be talking about all those things and how they flow together and or don't flow together. Today, of course, we're primarily looking at gender identity, which is on that spectrum. And my point is, before we get started, is to point out that this is complicated. And as I said before, it's kind of a privilege to imagine that it is not complicated. But it is complicated. And we can leave many people out on the edge by failing to see that this is complicated and to imagining that the world is simple. So having said all that, let me introduce today our speakers. If you please come up. There are 5 speakers, and I'll sit up here as well. Coming up first here is Marianne, and Chance is behind her, and Danny is behind him, and that's Amy, and Rob McGregor also here. Sit wherever else you'd like. So we know Danny as an offspring of our congregation, beloved child of the congregation, now a young adult. Rob is also a member of our congregation. Marianne is a good friend of Ann Travers and Gwen Bird. And Amy is a good friend of Dre Mulder, who's away today, our youth program coordinator. And Chance is a good friend of Amy. And, so it's social networking at work here, getting our voices today. What I'm asking, as I said, we all met yesterday and got to know each other a little bit, and it was a lot of fun, actually, for me, and illuminating as well. So I'm really glad to see you here. What I've asked you to do is simply to introduce yourselves somewhat in the terms that I use, but you don't have to follow that lead. We're going to have the panel speak individually. I hope there'll be time for some of them to speak to each other. But we also do have an ending to this service and a chance afterward for more engagement with our guests today. So, do you feel comfortable going first, Marianne? Okay. Oh, am I? Yes.
I actually made a few notes because I was afraid I would forget who I am. So as you've heard, my name is Marianne Saunders, but I also am known as Sean, which is my legal name. And my gender presentation and my naming vary according to circumstance. I think of my gender as non-binary, so it's been a very long time since I've thought of myself as a man, but I don't think of myself as being a woman either. Nevertheless, I strongly identify with the feminine and always have from the time I was a small child. I, too, am a proud sissy. So I'm now 48 years old. Through much of my teenage years and my young adulthood, I really suppressed my gender. But when I was around 30, I started finding ways of being able to express it in limited kinds of ways. And I came up with a bunch of kind of compromises that allowed me to do that. But a couple of years ago, well, really before a couple of years ago, but it really came to a head a couple of years ago. Those compromises really stopped working, and I needed to find other ways to be able to live in the world. And so I have been on hormone therapy for the past 14 months. A lot of times people talk about a gender transition, and sometimes I talk about what I'm doing in terms of a transition. But I'm also, for me, slightly uncomfortable with that terminology because it suggests to me kind of movement from one kind of discrete location, gendered location, to another discrete gendered location. And I'm more engaged in a kind of exploration. I don't know where I'm going to end up. I don't have a goal for my gender except to be able to feel comfortable in the world as who I am. That's probably enough for now.
One thing I forgot to do is say my preferred pronouns.
Oh yeah,
this
okay.
is an important part of gender.
Yeah.
I'm a he, him guy.
So because my gender is flexible, I'm also quite flexible about pronouns. I really like feminine pronouns. I really like, there is an emerging group of gender-neutral pronouns. The ones that I like are Z, which is a kind of blending of she and he, and here, which blends her and him. But a lot of people have trouble with those, so I also am okay with what's called singular they, where you use they, them, and their to refer to a single person. I tolerate masculine pronouns, but they are in fact my least favorite. But I do tolerate them. So.
Are you ready to go next, Chance? Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. My name is Chance, and I'm what you would call a female to male transgender, which means I used to be a girl, now I'm not so much. I guess, okay, what was it? Sex, female, gender, male, orientation, lesbian with a beard. What was it?
Gender role.
Gender role.
Like I
No. I don't know. I like hockey, but you know, I don't know. To me, there is no gender role. I don't know. It's hard to explain. So, I guess for me, my story of how I got here was kind of interesting, I think, anyways. When I was younger, I had a brother, and I really didn't realize that there was a difference between us. I didn't understand why he got to have short hair, and I didn't. I thought that was kind of weird. So I always wanted to have short hair, because I felt like that was funner, that was better. I wanted short hair. Long hair, you have to brush it, you have to put bows in it, and who wants to roll around with bows? So uncool. So, but then, you know, everybody told me it's just because I'm a tomboy. And that's normal. It's normal for girls to have their tomboy phases, right? So I was like, okay, cool, whatever. I'll wear pants. As I started to get older, and I started to kind of hit that point in my life where, you know, you start to have feelings for people. Your orientation's starting to kick in. Whew. I started to realize I like girls. I didn't like boys, and apparently that's not right. Apparently I was supposed to like boys. But I didn't. At all. Not that there's anything wrong with you guys. So, again, I started to get confused, because I'm like, well, I don't understand. Why am I not like all the other girls? And then they said, oh, it's just because you're a butch lesbian. Oh, okay, so now it's okay. It's okay for me to be the way that I am, and it was cool. But then, again, it started to feel weird. I started to get into relationships with people, and I started to realize like I just felt that something was wrong. Puberty hit, I didn't like it. I felt like something was just not right. I wasn't comfortable with the way that my body was turning out. You know, I was very curvaceous and vivacious. I was just very womanly. And that didn't suit me in the way that I felt. And so I realized, you know what? Something's not right here. And so I decided, I was actually in acting school, if you believe it or not. I decided that I was going to try and see what it was like to portray a male. And see what it was like to be a boy. And oh boy, did I like it. It was so much fun. And so I thought, okay, I'm gonna see where this leads. And then I started hormone therapy. I've been on it for 2 years. And I've loved every minute of it. I have an Adam's apple. I have razor burn all over my face. And it's great. So I guess I'm a boy now. So, hello.
Hi, I'm Danny. I use female pronouns, and my gender identity is female. And I was born female too, for those of you that don't know. I've had a really complicated relationship with gender. Not so much myself personally, but more like how the world views gender and how they view me. It's been a really complicated relationship. I cut my hair off when I was in grade 5, and almost instantly people started to question what my sexual orientation was, question who I was, and lots of people really tried to pigeonhole me and put me into boxes. Oh, you're a butch lesbian, or you're like sort of the same thing as you, or you're a tomboy, or you're gay, you know, stuff like that. And I was never really sure about that stuff then, because I was only in like grade 5. And people were being like, you're gay, and I was like, I have no idea. And yeah, so I went through my life a lot more, and then I started to meet other people that were like me, that had short hair and wore boy clothes but were girls, and started to sort of figure out, I guess, who I was. But lately I've been sort of thinking that, I guess I should start. At first I really assumed like the butch lesbian identity, and for me, like being a butch lesbian was about being like as butch as humanly possible. Like I was gonna be the person that was gonna fix cars. I was gonna be the person that was like tough and stood up for myself. I was gonna be the person that got all the girls, and my hero was James Bond. And after a while I started figuring that wasn't really me either. Like I was actually a really feminine person, and my whole life I'd sort of let a haircut decide who my personality was. And so after that I started really exploring and trying to break out of that box about what it meant to be a masculine female. And started to discover that I'm actually like really feminine. I just like short hair, like boy clothes, but actually I'm really like an effeminate and feminine person. And I'm not really sure what that means about my gender, I guess. Because I started to talk to a lot of people about what gender is about and what it means. And what I started discovering is that a lot of people aren't really sure. What it really is just like an expression of who you are, and it means something different for every single person. So I've been trying to really figure out, I guess, how I can make being female more me, and how I can explain that to other people. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's where I'm at with my gender identity right now.
Hi everybody, my name is Amy. To break things down to the categories we were talking about, I've transitioned from male to female, so the opposite direction of where Chance has gone. And sexual orientation is something that doesn't fit into neat categories for me. And as far as gender role, or as I usually call it, gender expression, in transitioning from male to female, I found out, or figured out, that I was a bit of a tomboy, which was a surprise. So, while many transgender people have very strong inklings when they're very young. This was never the case for me. I enjoyed a mix of traditionally male and traditionally female activities, and my mom was not just okay with this, but quite supportive and thought this was a good and healthy thing, making life a lot easier. When I started going through puberty, it felt very, very wrong for reasons I couldn't quite understand, and I was aware that there were people who transitioned from male to female, but I was first of all afraid to do that because any form of gender variance was quite severely punished where I was from, with ostracism or physical violence, both being quite likely, as well as unemployment, as one got into a period of life where employment was more important. And secondly, because I felt that identifying as female wouldn't work because the only immediate examples I could find of transgender people were highly gender normative. In my mid-20s, I decided to transition. And I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to be doing in terms of, I'm talking about medical transition here. I was going to medically transition away from the male, except I didn't really know where I was going because I had conflated the concept of gender expression and gender identity. If one is transitioning to, someone who's transitioning to female must presumably also be feminine. Somebody who doesn't identify as male or female is presumably androgynous. And I've roughly maintained the same gender expression, and I have an experience of coming across as a somewhat Aspergery gender variant male, and then transitioning into being a gender variant female, and being quite surprised in terms of what this means for how people take my gender, as I was expecting it to experience an extreme amount of sexism, or a difference in it, but I've found that being a gender variant male or being a gender variant female both have a lot of pros and cons in society that are difficult to quantify in terms of which is better or which is worse day to day. Also in transition, I've developed an interest in neckties and welding. There we go. That was it.
I'm Rob. I think the neckties and welding was a transition or a segue over for me. I got a note in preparation for this morning. I got a note from Stephen saying that Rob McGregor will be on the panel and he's cis male. And I went, what the heck is that? So I Googled it and I did a lot of reading, and it was absolutely fascinating. It was incredible to, in a very short time, realize a whole bunch of things about my gender that I had taken for granted, that I was just totally ignorant of, that I'd struggled with. So physically, I'm a male. I was born male. My orientation is heterosexual. My gender role, I guess, is the place where I can kind of identify, because experiences, I'll just go back a bit, experiences as a child, I'm not going to say a lot about this. I knew too early that I was heterosexual, so I'll just leave it at that. But what I was extremely emotional and extremely sensitive. And so I had the body of a macho guy, but I had the heart of a woman. And I modeled myself after my dad, who was out there and strong and a strong male figure. But I preferred my mom's approach, which was quiet and nurturing and caring. When my kids were quite young, my son was born in '78. In '85, I think it was, I stayed home with my kids for 7 years. And I hate the term Mr. Mom. I was the nurturer, I was the caregiver. I went to all of the meetings and the swim meets and everything. And all the women in town wouldn't talk to me, because in that small town, if a woman was seen talking to a man who wasn't her husband, they must be having an affair. And none of the men would talk to me because I couldn't be a real man, because I didn't have a job. But what I did notice was that I loved juicing people on it. And so I would intentionally find the most macho guy and go over. And he'd tell me about his day and the macho things he was doing. And I'd tell him about how hard it was, keeping the kids and making sure they had the right things. I would freak them out. So I entertained myself with that kind of discomfort for a lot of years. I guess I needed to do it to help me to deal with that difference that I felt. What else should I tell you? I had an experience when I was doing hospital chaplaincy in Hawaii. A lot of you have heard about Abigail, who was somebody who was in the psych ward in the hospital, and I was called down to spend some time with her. And I was told, see the nurse before you go into the psych ward, and I did. And the last thing the nurse said to me in filling me in as to what was going on was, oh, and Abigail's, I think the term was transvestite. And I kind of went, I'm not quite sure what that means. So my best reply was, well, what do I call Abigail? And the nurse looked at me funny and said, Abigail. Okay, Abigail was 6'4", very blonde, very, very muscular, First Nations person, and her roommate's pimp had just beaten her roommate, and the baby had died. And so Abigail couldn't find her fulfillment as a woman that she was hoping for in raising her roommate's child. And it was an absolutely fascinating 4 hours of trepidation, fear, awe, wonder that I went through with Abigail. And we sat through most of it holding hands, and she would lean into me and cry at times. And I realized through the whole thing that she was a human being. And that's how I responded to her, was as a human being. And all of this stuff went away. I just want to say something about, that ties in with the male privilege. That was in 91, 92, I think. And I read a book, Ann Wilson Schaaf, Women's Reality. Absolutely worth reading. I learned more about being a man from that book than I had from anything else that I'd ever experienced in my life. It was fascinating. I was going somewhere with that. What I found is this has been a very emotional process for me. I'm now consciously incompetent in being aware of the gender issues that you folks have had to deal with. I've been privileged because I can walk into a store and I know exactly where the clothing is that I'm going to buy. I can walk downstairs and I know which bathroom to go into. All of that is privilege that I just took for granted. And it wasn't until yesterday when I saw Mary Ann going for the washroom, and I noticed I was watching to see which washroom she went into. And I thought, I've just taken that for granted. So I'm very now conscious of the, well, I got two privilege pieces. I'm white male, in the white male system, and I'm cis male. So I have a huge privilege that these folks have not experienced. It's been absolutely illuminating and terrifying to be part of this and to sit up here and to go through all the feelings that come with it.
Thanks, Rob. You've raised one little term that he's saying cis male. It isn't SIS male, it's CIS male. And CIS before a word is a chemical term. That's something I don't, yes, go ahead, Amy, please do that.
Okay. To step back in an analogy for a moment, the term heterosexual, at one point, homosexual used to be a mental health diagnosis, and then one of the things that Kinsey introduced the world to in the 40s or 50s was that sexuality would occur on the spectrum, and some people would be on the homosexual end of the spectrum, and some people would be on the heterosexual end of the spectrum. The thing that he was attempting to correct was the idea that some people were normal and some people were homosexual. And he was saying, well, it's heterosexual, homosexual, these are both versions of acceptable sexuality. Cisgender is to transgender in the same way. Anyone who's done a little bit of organic chemistry may know about the prefix cis and trans. Cis to be on the same side and trans to cross. Comes up in astronomy as well, cislunar and translunar, and organic chemistry, cispat and transpat. So cisgender is a way of referring to people who are non-transgender without implying that one is normal and the other is abnormal.
Thank you. So I'm just going to, I know this is almost like a teaser to just hear this much. So I'm just going to ask each of you if there's one, and Rob, I'm going to say that you've said, I think, everything you want to, but Amy, hold on to the mic. What's the one thing that you want people to hear from you that you haven't said yet? Or if any of the others are ready to do that, you could go next.
I guess the number one thing I would say is just to, you can do anything, trying to view gender as a spectrum instead of just girls or boys is like the most helpful thing that you could possibly do for kids like me that grew up and were constantly trying to be fit into the girl or boy box. If you can just like see people like me and be like, you're just who you are and like do what you want with your body and your life, then like that's just the awesomest thing ever.
I'm going to say two things, but they're going to be quick. First is this might be of interest to people here, and so if we're talking later on, it's something I would be very happy to talk more about. I've been married to my partner for 20 years. We've known each other for 30 years. We met in church when we were teenagers, and my own faith life, my own church life, I'm an Anglican, had always been a kind of arm's length thing, but within a few months of starting hormones, my spirituality deepened in ways that I had no idea it would. This has been the biggest surprise for me about the hormone therapy, is that deepening spirituality, which I didn't even know was in me. So that's the one thing. And then another thing, I want to tell you something that someone told me when it was about a month before I started the hormone therapy. I hadn't officially been approved for it yet, although I knew I would be, so I hadn't started, and I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was really worried. I said to her, I'm scared that people won't like me, that they'll think I'm freakish, that they'll find me strange, that my body will be too alienating to them, and that I will lose friends, I will lose family, I won't be loved, I won't be lovable. And she said to me, I think that people could only love you more because you will be more yourself. And I just want to give that to you as something, if you find yourself, and it doesn't even have to be with a trans person, it could be with anyone, but it was the most beautiful thing. It gave me a lot of courage, and so I give that to you as something that might be useful at some point.
If I have one thing to add, if you follow the change in the media dialogue around the idea of transgender, there is this increasing awareness of the unnecessary focus on the genitals of trans people as being a defining and really important characteristic. And there is a move increasingly over to looking at the forms of marginalization that trans people face. And the extraordinary difference in the kinds of marginalization that trans people face. I have a very privileged existence, but which comes about because I have a good education, I'm white and in middle class, and people, and I am generally taken not to be a transsexual when people meet me, or if I'm taken to be a transsexual, people assume I'm a female to male transsexual. Which creates a lot of fine situations. People who do not have these privileges often experience quite extreme forms of marginalization. What was that? I'm trying to think of a way of ending this on an upbeat note. It's just not coming together in my head.
It's okay, we know it's not a finished story.
Okay. Sorry? Yeah, it's... when we take a look at how trans people are represented in the media, if we can think about, is this looking at trans people and focusing on our genitalia and the history of our genitalia and saying this is what defines us and will always define us as human beings, or is it talking about the lived experience of people who are breaking with gender norms and the intersections in their lives that may privilege or oppress them? And I'm glad to see media moving in the latter, but it's a thing to keep in mind.
So, gosh, this is so hard. Having like a brain aneurysm over here. Oh, okay, I got something. I know for me that, you know, if you're really interested, is you should actually really ask questions, because the thing is that we know both genders now. There's no secrets, okay? I know the way that a woman thinks. I know the way that a man thinks. Very different, really is a Mars-Venus thing. I did not realize that. But then again, that's the gender binary thing. But now it's kind of like understanding that full spectrum kind of thing. So ask questions. You know, get curious. Have fun with it. I'm very open about it. I'll answer any of your questions. And don't be afraid. Don't feel uncomfortable. You know, if you're uncomfortable, you make me uncomfortable. And I don't like to be uncomfortable. So be brave. Okay, that's it.
Hold on, I don't want you to applaud because we're actually responding musically. And so look up 1053 in your teal hymn books. And that's going to be this level of thank you to our panel.